Started. So welcome everyone to our fifth session on what anchor institutions should know or need to know about affordable housing. I'm Tony Sorrentino here at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and it's my pleasure to introduce Megan E. Lenz, a great young scholar in the United States focusing on the impact that anchor institutions are having on the economy, on communities, on neighborhoods, on gentrification, on neighborhood change, for another phrase to use. You've all gotten Megan's background information and bio and a couple of copies of her writings. I encourage you to Google the work that she's been doing. It's really quite something. We're going to turn it over to Megan to walk us through this final session, which is devoted to the case study. We've spent several months talking about the components we all ought to be aware of and knowledgeable about, whether it's data collection, whether it's how the private sector plans and works to produce privately supplied affordable housing. We've talked about the history of anchor institutions, and we've talked about the history and present of affordable housing policy. As you all think about what's next for you in your journey towards leading an anchor, I wanted to have Megan walk us through her approach to preparing the case study, which will be a decent template for all of you to take notes and to follow and to apply as you are engaging with your leadership at your anchor institution. So with that, I turn it over to Megan. There'll be no breakout sessions today. Megan's going to do a talk, and when she's finished, we're going to open it up to Q&A for the final, say, 10, 15 minutes. Thanks.
So Tony, I'm aiming for 11:50-ish, 11:45-ish.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. I will see how far I get, but we'll do what we can. So I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you so much. I am an urban planner at heart, so that's sort of how I identify. I'm associate professor and associate director of planning at Arizona State University. I've been here in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. I've been here about 8 years. But prior to that, I was in Philadelphia with Tony at University of Pennsylvania. So that's where I did my PhD. And I research sort of two main streams, just very broadly. I research affordable housing issues with an emphasis on shared equity, home ownership, community land trust, things like that. I'm part of a new HUD-funded center that we just are launching here, the Arizona Research Center for Housing Equity and Sustainability. And so that's where some of that work is starting to live for me. But my other sort of passion area is in anchor institutions, which is what I've been doing for, at this rate, about 10 years I've been in this space, looking at the role of universities as anchors, what they're doing in neighborhoods and communities, and sort of what that means also in the space of university adjacent housing markets. And I will say very briefly, I give Tony a lot of credit for bringing me into this particular space. My interest in the anchor institution and universities and what they do started with Tony and his office, with Craig in the EVP's office, where I did some research for them, and it sort of led to all of this. So today, this is the agenda. We're going to get through what I can get through. But again, focused on that process of how I think about these things when I develop a case study in a sort of smaller, more tool-focused way. So a quick impression of how I've approached my research towards anchor institutions, how I think about these things, talk about the case study, its utility, its importance, walk you through the process. And then if I have time, I'll look at the Duke example as sort of this more blown out process, just to illustrate how I connect all of these dots to tell a story. So quick note about positionality, because I think that's really important and informs the way that I approach research and the choices that I make about data and the purpose of what I'm doing. So I came to urban planning initially as a practitioner. So I have a bachelor's and master's in planning. I worked in the field for several years in the city of Milwaukee. And then I sort of circled back into academia from there. So my positionality really comes from this applied research, tool-focused, policy-focused place. I don't want to be in that metaphorical ivory tower, just writing away in my papers. I actually want to do things on the ground that matter to the folks here in this room. And I also really value a reflexive process that values multiple perspectives. So in my case study work, I do my utmost to sort of understand these different perspectives. And actually, I'm going to move to the next slide because it very much shapes the way that I work with anchor institutions. I'm sure you are all no stranger to the idea that anchor institutions can be contentious, right? So I view my goal as a bit of a reality check coming into this space, neither fully embracing the idea that anchor institutions are these philosophical saviors, right? Everybody's complicated. Everybody has different perspectives and needs and demands. So really building on the shoulders of this greater good, this self-enlightened interest, the work of like Ira Harkavy and Democracy Collaborative, but also recognizing there's this push-pull tension, right? There are other scholars who talk about, well, it's more complicated than that, and there are ramifications for neighbors, and what do we think about this? And so I position myself in neither of the polarizing aspects, but more as understanding the role and the motivations and the impacts. And then how do we leverage, what levers do we tweak to bring those things closer in alignment, to amplify the good and mitigate some of the harms that may come from any of those players along the way. So to do that, I tend to engage in mixed method work. So I use a lot of surveys and interviews, textual analysis, census data to think about conditions on the ground, think about perspectives and choices and behaviors, and then knit those together to build theory, but also inform practice. So when I say that I'm a mixed methods researcher, I place a very high value on looking beyond just the numbers, beyond the quantitative story, the number focused questions. And so I think it's a lot more useful to use case studies, and this is why case studies are so powerful, to think about what happened, not just how a neighborhood changed, not just how like the economic impact or whatever it may be, but what happened. This is a really strong method, case studies, for thinking about this holistic view of the problem, of the issue, and then exploring these contextual, context-dependent issues. And you have the opportunity to sort of use the case study to get at the nuances, get at the sort of specifics to the case, but then hopefully draw them up to the higher lessons learned that then others around the table can deploy in their own context. And that's the value of this space. Recognizing that we're all into like all these cases, all these universities, all of your own contexts. You're individuals, you have the individual factors, but there are lessons learned that we can trade and then adapt appropriately. So I'm going to very quickly kind of get in the academic weeds for a moment, and then I'll kind of draw back out. But case study research it's very in-depth, very rigorous, and so a lot of my work, because I'm in an academic space, lives in that space, these really in-depth case studies, substantial investment in data collection and analysis, and this rigorous analytical method. But the Penn IUR case studies that you looked at for today, those are smaller bites, right? So they follow the same principles. They play this important role for understanding a phenomenon, but the depth of the data is different. And I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about how case studies can look from that sort of in the weeds perspective, the methods perspective, but then draw back out to the process of these sort of easier bite-sized tool approaches. So there are generally three broad categories of case studies when you use this. So exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory. Exploratory case studies give you the option to really test out an idea of research, to test the waters and define questions or hypotheses. And this is usually for this a larger survey and endeavor. It's sort of that first step in the water. Descriptive case study is used to describe a particular phenomenon within its context, right? So you can expand on a particular theme. Maybe you took a large brush survey, this exploratory approach, and then you found something you're really interested in. You dive in through a descriptive to say, let's explore this particular phenomenon further and sort of map out all of the various nooks and crannies of that issue. The explanatory case study looks at the cause and effect. So here we're looking at the relationships, the cause and effect within this case, and we're looking to explain exactly how did this happen? Why did this happen within this context? So really those very specific particulars. And then there's the number of case studies, which is relevant to allowing how you can leverage the knowledge in different ways and use that in your case. So we can do single case studies or we can do multiple case studies. Single case studies, you can go really deep into a particular phenomenon, but it's less generalizable. You can't look at Duke alone. I can't dive into their structure and then say, and now everybody can do this, right? Because I only really understand the phenomenon through the lens of that particular environment. But there are a number of different types of single case studies that you might use, and each of them have a rationale. So maybe you have a really extreme or a unique case. A single case study is an appropriate way to look into that as sort of an exemplar that you can then distill out to other things. It can be representative, it can be a longitudinal case. So I've done research looking at Penn, over time and sort of understanding how did Penn, not just how did they start, but then over time, going back or going forward rather, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, what does that mean for them? Those types of single case constructs can be really useful. The multiple case study approach allows for that comparative work. For me personally, I live in that space a lot. I may write single case studies like the Duke example that allowed me to go really deep and go chase all different kinds of paths within that. But I live a lot in the space of comparative work because I think it's really valuable in sort of understanding the suite of choices, the suite of constructs that allow for a university to make this choice versus that choice. And that's what the Penn IUR examples show in this. I also use a lot of data. So I never use just one source, right? The goal with case study work is to work towards triangulation. And so trying to find multiple data sources that help tell the same story, but from different angles. So you're finding common themes, you're using, I just have a list of different things that I will use in research design within case study work, but things like surveys. I often use surveys in my work. I've used like national surveys to sort of say, hey, who's an anchor? What are you doing in terms of anchor institutional revitalization efforts? Send it out to all of these universities and then do case study selection from that. Surveys can be a bit of a filter. I've used interviews, participant observation, archival research, content analysis. So looking at reports, looking at meeting minutes, looking at local government documents, ordinances or plans that have been filed, things like that, news stories, and then visual data. But the goal is triangulate across multiple sources around the same story to make sure you really understand all angles of that story. And then saturation. So the idea is when you do interviews, you want to talk to enough people where you feel like, oh yeah, I've heard all of these themes. Like I now feel like I've heard all these themes multiple times. No new ideas aren't cropping up. If you keep hearing new ideas, it means, well, you've not hit saturation. You've not heard all the stories yet. And so you use that as a collective. All right, so I want to dial back up a bit and go into my process of how I wrote these case studies for Penn and Penn IUR. So in this case, these are case studies that are meant to be very hands-on, very bite-sized, very much giving sort of a breadth of what's going on in the space of universities engaged in affordable housing. And so the first thing that I want to do when I'm engaged in this work is I want to figure out what is my research question? What am I doing here? What is the purpose of the case study? The sort of the guiding star of this. And it's important to really establish the parameters of that scope. And so you have a clear intent when you're going into your case study research. You're able to begin defining the elements, defining the sort of data needs, and really have a clear vision before you go into any of your case study sites about what it is you are doing there. In this case, the guiding research question for the Penn IUR cases, we're thinking about how are university anchor institutions engaging with and or pursuing affordable housing concerns. And I had 2 follow-up questions that I sort of had flagged in my mind. That was to get at the actionable insights as well. So what actions are they taking? And then what's motivated them to do that? And that was the scope, right? It was a very targeted, very narrow scope to kick this process off. Once you have a guiding research question, you're then thinking about case selection. This is a super important phase of research. I do this differently depending on the type of research project that it is. For deeper dive academic research, I'm looking at that exploratory process. I'm looking at broad surveys to guide me towards appropriate cases. I have specific criteria that I'm looking, that I'm establishing on the front end, and then looking at the whole host of options. This project was a little bit different, right? So this was a bit more of an intentional case study selection, which from an individual institution wanting to learn about what others are doing, that's perfectly appropriate. And so in this case, I was working with Penn IUR. I was working with the Anchor Institution Roundtable to sort of say, all right, what are the criteria that we care about here to have more of an apples to apples consideration? And so the criteria that I looked at was urban and mid-sized universities, some regional variations. So didn't want everything to be on the East Coast, the West Coast example, or for example, variation in the sector of the university. So a little bit of public, a little bit of private, and then expert awareness, leaning on myself and other experts to say, hey, do you know of things that are happening? So we weren't sort of going down rabbit holes that weren't appropriate to this project. The goal at the end of the day with the multiple case studies, with the comparative case studies, is to look for common threads that allow for variation. So you can see, the different choices that are out there, the different strategies, inputs, motivations. And it's about learning some key lessons from each of these universities, as opposed to combing through every university to find the unknowns. So based on that set of criteria, these are the cases that we landed on for the Penn IUR process. And so each of these cases represented universities where we knew that something was happening, didn't know all the particulars about what, but we knew there had been some activity that linked to affordable housing, alongside variation in the sector, the region, and the size of the institution as well, sort of similar apples to apples size. Arizona State, where I am, for instance, we're 100,000 students just on ground. That's a completely different scale from this group. And so we wanted to keep that in mind as well. Then we move into case parameters. This is sort of the next step here. So again, the depth and the purpose of your case study, knowing that up front is really important. In this case, I wasn't doing extended site visits. I wasn't doing a full suite of interviews with community members and developers and every stakeholder involved. And I didn't have a survey as a baseline collector. So I knew that up front, and I knew that, all right, I need to find triangulation through other ways. Because this was more of like a working case study, there were three things that I prioritized. One, I wanted to make a really solid connection with the university partner. So prioritizing the offices that were most knowledgeable about what the university was doing in affordable housing and could speak to the student housing angle, to the developer angle, to the community engagement angle. In some cases that was talking to multiple people, in others it was just sticking with the one. But identifying that sort of starting point within the university was really crucial. I collected publicly available data. Tony mentioned you had a whole session on American Community Survey and the census. I collect that data to understand trends in the neighborhood over time in socioeconomics, demographics, housing markets. In this case, in the case studies, I actually didn't pull that through to these case studies, but it's data that I have set aside that I think is really important as sort of an underlying baseline. And in the future versions of these case studies, that's going to be super relevant. And then again, I work to then triangulate things. So the university contact itself is not enough. I want to hear from, I want to see institutional reports. I want to see, in many cases, there's collaboration with the city. So I'm looking at the city's, documents and their reports. I'm looking at news reports and sources, other relevant websites and meeting minutes, to really get a full context of what happened. As you all know, I'm assuming most of you are situated within universities. You have a story, right? You have a really important story, but there are lots of other people that are outside of you that are saying, no, that's not the full story. And when I'm developing a case study, I want to know that. And I want to sort of be able to say, not say, well, you're right and they're wrong, or vice versa, but I want to know, like, what's the controversy and how does that fit into the story or not, but I don't want to be surprised by it. And so the goal here is to bring in those nuances to really substantiate the big picture that you're trying to tell with any of these things. And then, if I'm doing my job well, I will see through this process of bringing in all these outside sources, I will see those linkages developing. I will see that triangulation coming together. If everything is a mess and it's all like laying out separately on a table, I'm missing something, and then I know that, and I need to chase down some additional information. So at this point in the process, I've picked cases, I've gone through those parameters, I've got that initial data and insights, and now I'm doing a couple things in my preliminary analysis. So I'm taking notes and sort of writing memos to myself. I'm making note of key concepts and questions that are arising in the research, because in this case, I'm not thinking about just one university, I'm thinking about 7. And so a question that comes up in University A is going to shape what I do in B through F, G, in those other cases. So I'm making notes about common threads. I'm making notes about unique circumstances, key ideas that I'm learning about the research question. And, am I learning something here that might be relevant in another case? I need to ask a different question. I need to look for a different source. All of this is the process of creating a baseline story for myself. So for me, that means my baseline story, my very first thing that I'm doing after I've picked my university, I've identified my stakeholder. I want to talk to the university first and just get their take on what's happening. And I want to look at university published reports. That's my baseline, because that is the unit of analysis for me. And from there, I will sort of draw circles out to other stakeholders. But that's the foundational story. How's the institution interpreting this for themselves? And then that helps me figure out what directions I need to go beyond that. As I work through this really early case study development, with one of the things that I will start with is a case that I have more familiarity with, or like a particularly robust sense of resources. When you're starting with 7, you've got to start somewhere. And so I usually try to pick one that I have familiarity with, because at least I have a little bit of footing, because I need to think about the tangible case, the structure of my case study, just the order of what I'm going to write about. Because what I do in case study A, ideally I want to mimic, or at least use that as a baseline for how I design the rest of the cases. So I figure out those components in the first case study. It's a bit of an iterative process. I might get through the first 3 and realize, oh, there's like a really critical thing that I've not been covering. So I'm going back. It's not like I closed the chapter and I'm done. But that really is the next step. You don't want to shoehorn any case study into a super rigid framework, but you do want to have guideposts for where you're going along the way. So in this case, it's very simple and straightforward, but it takes thought. Thinking about the introduction and the overview, thinking about the appropriate amount of background context for each case. It's really easy to get into that ACS data and be like, I'm going to write 6 pages on how this neighborhood has existed over the last 15 years. Turns out for these cases, that wasn't the story. That wasn't the purpose of what we were doing, but I had to know that. I then, in these case studies, went into the anchor strategy discussion. So really defining the big picture for each of these, and then progress and next steps of their work. That's what worked for these cases, but you don't know that until you're kind of into the data and thinking about it. Lastly, as I move through additional cases and what I'm hearing, I'm thinking about the comparative analysis across cases. So I'm asking myself a series of questions at all times about what are the linkages? What are the common structural features or motivations? Am I hearing something that resonates across others? And then what are the distinctions? So, both sides of the coin. At the end of the day, I'm asking these questions because I am trying to build some kind of typology. I am trying to have some kind of rationale for why these places. And if someone goes to this series of cases as a collective, I need to sort of be able to signal to them, this is a strawberry, this is a cherry, this is an orange, right? All fruits, but they're a little bit different, and this is what you're going to learn. And I want to signal that kind of recognizable pattern, or the buckets of distinction along the way. I think that a typology as a tool, when you have multiple case studies, is so, so useful. It makes it much more accessible and much more powerful for someone to find value in that. And so that's what I'm looking for very early on, and it's very much an iterative process. I generally, when I do this work, I have an initial impression of what a typology might look like, but I'm going to write that in pencil. I'm not, I'm not ready to like Sharpie that on a wall. That's in pencil, and it's very iterative, and you're going back, you're going back, you're going back. In the case of the IUR case studies, I think for me personally, this is the first phase of the work. I plan to delve into these cases, these models much more thoroughly, and I expect my typology will shift. So for me, I focused on a pretty simplistic typology, which is that it was models. It was all focused on bite-sized, little synopses of like the model for each of these, but I didn't try to put them into further buckets, like stratify them further into these three are this, these three are this one is its own thing. So I wanted that recognition, but in future work, I will work towards distilling the typology more clearly and further and finding those commonalities and distinctions. All right, so I have like roughly 10 minutes left, so I'm going to speed through this, but I wanted to sort of show how I tell a story with all of this data. And the Duke case was an academic case study, right? So it's really big, lots of data. It was a very long process, but I want to talk about how, just sort of paint the picture of how it all comes together. So the Duke case looks at 12 Durham neighborhoods that they've been involved with since 1993. I'm going to skip a lot of these slides, or I might just highlight on the slides where the data came from, because I have 10 minutes, but I can go back to any of it. So the question here was, how can a university design its anchor model to align with local neighborhoods and generate some degree of mutually beneficial outcome? It was a single case study. It was only looking at Duke University. And I collected a bunch of data sources. So this particular case study included 2 rounds of semi-structured interviews at 2 different points in time. So it was in 2014 and 2018. I believe 2017. So 2 rounds of semi-structured interviews with university administrators, with staff, community development partners, elected officials, neighborhood associations, and other residents. A whole bunch of people. It was content analysis from news media, institutional reports, other university documents, and neighborhood plans and reports. And then it was data on neighborhood conditions. So housing, socioeconomic, demographic data between 1990 and 2015. And this case study ended up telling 2 side-by-side stories within it. One that was focused on downtown strategy, one that was focused on a neighborhood strategy. That was one way, that's something that emerged during the process, that it wasn't one story, it was 2 stories. And I think I'm just going to leave it there. I can very happily come back to any of this. I started with a historical lens, so understanding the motivations and how this unfolded was really relevant. I didn't know that this was going to be part of the case in the beginning, but it became evident to me that in order to understand what Duke does today, it actually is really relevant that Duke had been this booster in its community in a way that's quite different from Penn, for instance, where I also have a full case study. The role of Duke and Durham was very different. They were a huge actor in a small community. They had sort of sidestepped a lot of controversy over time, and they were in the position of, there's no one else here to do this, which I think Penn could say too, but in a different way. The tone is very different. So there's a historical lens to this that helped illuminate the issues. There's a more recent historical lens that helped understand that, politically Duke did a lot of things to show that they were a community booster and that they were here and that they were they needed to be the ones that we leaned on, but it wasn't perfect. There's a lot of tension. There was a lot of conversation about the race dynamics that were really relevant, are really relevant in Durham. And then I come to sort of interviews, right? That I'm leveraging. So there's that backstory that provides the fundamental knowledge, and then coming to interviews that helped me understand what was the moment. What was the moment that you all realized that this is a problem? What were the perspectives? What were the stakeholders worried about, thinking about, motivated by along the way? And you get this sort of bifurcation in this conversation, in these interviews with the players. On the one hand, I hear from the community engagement staff within the university talking about how the tobacco industry had really gone up in smoke, and that Durham was this gritty, ugly tobacco community without a lot of energy, and there were all these vacant, boarded up homes. On the other hand, I have the executive vice president's office who really led the downtown effort, saying downtown was, quote, going to hell in a handbasket. It was better than a doormat. It was like a very Southern conversation, very charismatic individual that I spoke with, right? But sort of immediately you get this sense of like, there was this neighborhood pressure and there was this downtown, like, who are we, Durham pressure. And those two things were there from the start. There was a leadership change. So, pointing to that, and this comes again out of interviews and out of news reports, and understanding Mineral Keohane and how she thought about this work and why she thought the way she did about this work. And then there's this whole story that kind of emerges in terms of what they actually did, and the details of what they did, and the process of what they did. So again, I'm just, in the interest of time, I want to just flip through and say, in the process of doing the case study, through all of this data, through all of these conversations, I was able to say, all right, I see 3 common threads here on the neighborhood side. That I don't have the downtown side because it's a different story, but also there were common threads there. But in the neighborhood side, I was able to say, after all of these conversations and really sitting with this and memoing to myself, I can see the 3 common threads, the principles that guided their work. And then I can talk about what they were, define them, and pull in all this data to sort of substantiate that. And so we have community engagement, a community empowerment model was very important to Duke. That was one of the key things that they did from the beginning. And I talked about how that played out, decisions that were made, pointed to documents and reports that showed how it was implemented over time and what that meant for future phases of the work. The second principle that, again, they don't have these written down anywhere. This isn't Duke naming these. This is me coming with these, was this idea of quiet partnership, of the recognition that Duke is a huge elephant in the room, and we cannot just stomp all over everything, say we're Duke and we're here, and have it be well received. We need to know our place. We need to know what resources we have and what we can offer, but we don't need to be at the front waving our flag. We can be in back. And that's the purpose is changed. It's not to get credit. And so talking about that and talking about all the different ways, it's very tiny on your screen, but this is this whole map of all of the housing things that they've done over, from 1993 to 2019, all of the different ways Duke partnered, and demonstrates this idea of quiet partnership, the investments they made, the partnerships they made, the things that they were a part of, but Duke wasn't stamped all over it. And then the mobility of capital was the third principle that emerged. And it was this idea that not everything's going to work all the time. And so sometimes we're going to try something and we're going to realize that, like, hey, that's actually not the right problem definition. We know the solution, but that's not the right way to do it. We're going to pick up and move our money in a different way. We're going to tackle it from a different angle, or we're going to invest in something. And over the Waltham neighborhood, for instance, was this neighborhood where Duke really started, one of the 12 where it really started, and they made big investments through lots of partners, did lots of things, but 10 years down the line, they didn't need to invest there in the same way, right? The problem had shifted, changed, moved to a different area, etc. And so mobility of capital was this recognition. And, this is kind of just the end of the case study, which is all to say, they're still doing this. This process is iterative. And so in this case study, that's how I end this, is that, yeah, new challenges have emerged, and the things that worked working in 12 neighborhoods in very focused ways, it's not really what's working for housing from a housing perspective, or really from any of their anchor strategies anymore. Now they're thinking, how do we figure out a regional housing strategy? How do we become an anchor, a convener for that? And so for Duke, that's where they're moving, and they're looking at things like this is the same house sold for $126,000 in February 2019. Is the picture here on the left. And then it was sold in 2021 for $869,000, or it's now valued by Zillow's estimate. It's sold for almost 800,000, but now it's valued at 870. This is what they're dealing with in our neighborhoods. That's a totally different problem than the start. And so talking about those changes of priorities and thinking about how do these principles that emerge translate as they move forward. All right, I'm going to stop there with that very brief overview. Hopefully that's helpful, and we can just chat.
Megan, that was tremendous.
Thank you.
That was so good on all levels, both the kind of scholarly quality of how one sets up the case study, the research that's needed, right down to the nitty-gritty of the details of your case study. I'm sure folks have some questions, but I want to jump in first. I didn't know I was going to ask this, but it's now in my mind. When you brought up quiet partnerships, Laura had a quote in the chat box about, this is a really important idea, and I couldn't agree more. I've learned this over the years that a lot more gets done when you don't care who takes credit, right? Universities, anchor institutions, large or small, have an outsized role. And if the more they take credit, the worse they look. It's just a weird fact of life, right? I wanted to ask you about this sense of scale, as you've waded into this idea of the neighborhood scale and what it means to be an anchor in a smaller defined neighborhood, and the citywide scale or even a regional wide scale. Like, Mary's here from Barnard, Upper West Side, really big scale, right? Chad's here in Harrisburg. It's a smaller kind of scale, but his institution plays a bigger role. In all of your research, and you've done a lot of research, have you found any of these threads that you may have pulled together? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but is there anything we can learn about anchors and scale? Is it more effective regional, city, or neighborhood?
I would say that I think being involved in all three really matters, because I think the problems are really different, right? The problem that you're going to address at a neighborhood level is you can't address that at a regional level. So I actually think being involved in all three matters. The way you define this idea of partnership is going to change. I actually would expect that at a regional level, you flexing your name a little bit more as a convener is incredibly powerful. And you're bringing other players to the table because you can say, hey, we're here. We're putting money where our mouth is, like you come too. That's great at a regional level, or could be great at a regional level. But if you did that in a neighborhood, disaster, right? Or potential for a disaster. So I think being sensitive to those sort of that scale tied to action, I think matters. But I mean, as I know from your work, Tony, right? And I'm sure many of you on the call, being plugged into all of those skills is really relevant. Particularly, like I've been doing some recent work on student housing and university housing markets. And as we all know, like the global effects, right, are coming down to our neighborhoods and to our universities. And so understanding those and like what role do we have in that space, that's a completely new field.
I like your answer because it speaks to how we as anchor planners and anchor leaders have to think of ourselves as part of an iterative ongoing process. And we have to stay very agile. And like you said, being plugged in at different levels and different scales. There is no cookbook. It's not like add a little cilantro, take a little bit of brown sugar out, and the recipe is perfect. It doesn't exist. Every day, like we just found out yesterday, that there's a Mexico-based real estate developer who bought a piece of land near the campus and has got a plan for a 35-foot story tower of 500 beds for a methadone clinic, which caught everyone by surprise. And it's right next to Drexel and Penn. And so people are putting pressure on the universities, buy that person out, make that person go away. Like, you don't own the land. It just happens to be near us. What do you want us to do? But you're asked to solve problems.
Yeah, I think it's
And
really,
sometimes are the problem.
sorry, you cut out for a moment. Didn't mean to talk over you. I was just gonna say, like, I think it's really, that's the thing I find really interesting and why I try to position myself. There are some research out there that really wants to make the university responsible for everything and be like, everything is your fault. Like, you're there, you're responsible for fixing it all. Well, you're just another actor like anyone else is, albeit a powerful one often, right? And you have certain tools at your disposal that maybe others don't, but it doesn't make you responsible for everything. So this idea that, like, fix this, a private developer purchased a private piece of property and is doing something that the city is allowing via zoning, fix it. It's hard. So I do think, like, one of the things I really appreciated about Duke, one of the reasons I like their model and I talk about it so much, and this idea of partnership, was like they were very clear. We are not affordable housing experts. We don't know what our affordable housing developer partners know. And the community development finance institutions that are like in Durham working every day, and Habitat for Humanity, they are the experts on this. We have resources, we have other things we can do to support them, but we don't need to be the ones leading that. Let them lead that, and we'll support them, we'll amplify them, we'll provide them money, whatever it may be.
That- That's so critical about the idea of partnerships. I mean, I think as time moves on, a theme that's going to emerge is the idea that anchors don't do it alone, but that anchors are a partner amongst partners. They just happen to have a unique set of resources. And if they're leveraged wisely and considered wisely, they can really have impact. Laura Martin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I liked your comment in the idea about this idea of partnership, that quiet partnership. It resonated with you very much. Would you mind building on that just a little bit for the group?
Yeah, sorry, watch out. This is what happens when you put your camera on. I'm sorry, y'all. This fell off my
You're good.
calendar, so I have been trying to be as engaged as possible, but
You're good.
here I am. Thank you so much for your presentation, and also just for convening this space for us for the past couple of months. So I'm at the University of Mississippi, and we are rural, right? And so the reason that the quiet partnership resonated with me is that our enrollment growth is the elephant in the room. Our enrollment growth has resulted in the university implementing master leases with multiple apartment complexes within the city of Oxford, not all of which are purpose-based student housing. And this question then of displacement is significant, right? And so the research that we've done kind of looks at this tension between cost of living and compensation, not only for the university, but for other major employers. But of course, we are the major employer. And so in the conversations, I feel like the conversations here are stalling out because housing is a challenge that affects everyone. And yet, the university feels like this is perhaps out of our scope because this is the city. The city has an affordable housing commission that I'm a part of, yet the affordable land is in the county. We need infrastructure to be extended. And so I feel like it's one of these situations where, the elephant in the room truly does have this power to convene, to bring in this cross-sector conversation, right? And then also, of course, I am in the Deep South. There is just so much appetite for market-based solutions. And I feel that the market really has failed to ensure that there will be, sufficient supply, period, to say nothing of affordable options for homeownership, rentals, for students. I mean, I'm seeing the head nods, like perhaps we're not so unique, but I think I just wanted to hear from others who kind of necessarily, due to your geography or due to the nuances of your commitment, are really needing to operate way outside of a neighborhood solution. Like for me, I think this has legs at a county level, but even probably more likely at a multi-county pulling in our planning and development district type of a scenario. And I think the issue I'm running into is like, it's nobody's job, right? Or it's like just other duties out of assigned for enough people at enough institutions where I'm like, how do we thread the needle? So please, please enlighten me. I'm ready to receive your brilliance, all of you guys.
No, that's a great setup for a bigger conversation that is happening all over the country.
Mhm.
And it's happening in real estate markets that are in the South, the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest. It's happening everywhere. I mean, Megan, you look at markets around the country, you look at affordable housing trends, you look at anchor trends. This is the nexus of those two things. When you look at potential solutions for maybe increasing the supply of affordable housing by an anchor institution,
Mhm.
do you think it's happening at a neighborhood scale, city scale, multi-county scale? Are there a lot of political jurisdictions that would need convening? Is it the anchor's role, perhaps, or is it the mayor's role or a governor? How do you see the governance of this coming together?
Well, so I think Laura's point about, being in a more rural context is super relevant because it kind of matters where you are, like Marion, New York. I mean, there's a local role to be played, right? What it means to be local for Barnard is entirely different than what it means to be local in Tempe versus in Mississippi, in Oxford. The thing that I think a lot about is I tend to think that like local governments, so counties and cities, they just haven't figured out that like you should be leveraging these anchors more. I actually I think that the anchors are the ones that are sort of realizing we can come to the table and we can be solutions oriented and we can be conveners. But what I wish happened is I wish that these cities and these counties would realize, hey, you are a huge aggregator of people. You are a huge population draw for transitional students that are coming in and out all the time, but then also all your employees. We're going to talk to you more directly about what can we do to tap into the resources you do have, and then we can deploy them. And I don't think there are any really great examples of it. The thing a little bit that you see in not rural contexts, but in Boston and in LA, you see USC, for instance, and Harvard, right? They have to do these institutional master plans and they have to file them with the city, and the city has to approve them. So they can't do any growth, campus-based growth, or do anything until they have the cities sign off. And what it's meant in LA, for instance, the city of LA said, well, USC, we're not adopting your institutional master plan unless they have to pay $20 million over 10 or 15 years. I'm forgetting if it's 10 or 15. I think it's over a 10-year period. So they provided an initial upfront payment of $10 million. Again, scale is like completely different here, right, of the resources, but it's just an illustration of what they do. An initial $10 million payment that went into the city for like a housing trust fund sort of thing. And then a second payment of $5 million, which I think they just recently made. And then a third payment of $5 million unless they develop a certain amount of housing. They can get a waiver for that last amount if they like tip the balance. It's an interesting idea. I don't think it's been well deployed. I think that it meant that the city of LA had $10 million and then they sort of went to one project. Like it wasn't a big drop in the bucket. But I do think that idea, that concept that cities and counties could come together because they're the ones with the development, the local land use regulation, the development regulation, they could say, we need to all work together on this. What resources do you have that we can leverage better together? Because at the end of the day, you as a university, you don't control those developers. You don't control that infrastructure, that land, but you could certainly be players in the conversation. And Duke is trying to do some of this for a different, because they have major gentrification, like Durham has just changed wildly. I saw in the chat this Mary Haskett said, keep it gritty, right? That was definitely not the conversation before, but now it is. So they're trying to make a regional effort because similarly, they're like, we can't afford to buy houses. I will stop so other people can talk in 1 second. The other thing I wanted to say is community land trusts, wildly underutilized as a tool just generally across the country, but I think this is a place that university anchors could do more as well in terms of permanently affordable housing before it gets too expensive. And you can hold that, and it addresses the homeownership need. Like, what a great opportunity if we could figure out how to make that happen.
I think
Yeah,
your work is at this really fascinating intersection between community land trusts and anchor institutions. I think that happened by accident, or
yeah,
maybe there are no accidents. You know, when you and I met 10 years ago, you were studying community land trusts. I wanted you to help me study anchor institutions, and here we are, Megan, 10 years later on a Zoom call talking about community land trusts and anchor institutions. And so I
Still
think
beating
that's
that
the
drum.
universe. I think that's the universe speaking to us. Folks, let's thank Megan for a great presentation. That was really wonderful. We learned a ton. I'm going to package up a video production of this with Bobby's help, and we will be sending that out to everyone who signed up for this, the hundreds of people that did. This has been a super fun series for us to put together and host. I hope we get to do another one again. It could be on this topic, it could be on other topics, but there's no doubt that as cities change, regions change, politics change, there's this constant called the anchor institution, and the anchor institution isn't going anywhere by definition. And so we need people to study it and the best practices, and Megan is that she could join us today. With that, we are wrapped up. When I send out, Megan's put her email address at Arizona State in the chat. You'll also get her contact information when I send out a copy of this. So please be in touch with her for follow-ups. Megan, thank you so very much. This was great.
Thank you.
And thank you to all, especially those of you that hung out with us for several months in a row. We started, it was, I think it was February. And here we are in June. And I think we went on a fun little journey together. And I think at the end of the day, these 5 hours of content that we produced are going to make a contribution for people who are studying this topic. They'll be able to look at these sessions, hear these questions and answers as something archival at a moment when we are kind of redefining the whole field. It's a fascinating time. So nothing more to say after that, but thank you all.